for AARP Ohio. I lead the community outreach, local advocacy, and volunteer engagement efforts in Greater Cincinnati and Southwest Ohio. I know that many of you are joining us today from across the nation. We always like seeing where people are from. So if you would, in chat, tell us what city you are joining us from. Not sure if you can see the chat, but at the bottom of your screen, if you scroll, the chat is disabled. Okay, well, tell us in the Q&A. There you go. That's fine. Tell us in Q&A where you're from. Stockbridge, Georgia. Nice to have you. Tulsa, look at that. Cincinnati, yes. Hi, Rebecca. Oh, it's going fast now. Oh, wow, I can't keep up. Covington, Cross Lake, Minnesota, Medina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Cleveland, Gaithersburg, DC area. Awesome. So glad you all were able to join us this evening.
Wait a minute.
Okay. Well, again, welcome. And I'm going to turn this over in just a few minutes to our wonderful treasure volunteer, Sandy. Sandy is here. She's going to share with you how to make the most of today's conversation. Sandy, and just that one change that instead of in chat, because chat is disabled, they can make comments and ask questions in the Q&A, and Sandy can tell them where that is. Sandy?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sandra, and I'm an AARP volunteer in Cincinnati, Ohio. I collaborate with AARP to bring you engaging events like the one you're viewing right now. We appreciate you joining us for this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to walk you through how to engage with us during our time together. Move your mouse or cursor across the bottom of your screen, and you will see the chat icon and the Q&A icon. To comment, you can put it in the chat. To ask questions during the Q&A portion of the event, please put your questions in the Q&A icon. This helps us to access your questions quickly without scrolling through all those lovely comments. Also, after this AARP event, we will email you a link with a helpful handout. We're here also recording this presentation. In the coming weeks, you will be able to view it on AARP's Ohio's YouTube page at youtube.com/@AARP Ohio. Later in the program, we'll share some information and free resources to help family members care for themselves and those they love. As I mentioned, I'm a volunteer, and I've enjoyed volunteering with AARP because it allows me to use my time and talents, connect with people, develop new friendships. I also love that AARP trains and equips you for all of the different volunteer engagements that you decide to participate in. And we also like to have fun and enjoy the learning sessions such as the one for today. At the end of the program, my fellow volunteer, Linda, will tell you how you can get more involved with AARP and attend more AARP events. Before we begin, we recognize that many of you joining today are or will be a family caregiver for your parent, spouse, sibling, or loved one. So I want to take this opportunity to share some information that could help family members, family caregivers. AARP is working to promote the health and well-being of older Americans for more than 60 years. We want to support family caregivers so that they can safely care for their older loved ones. To learn how to handle hard feelings after caregiving ends, how to make a home safe for your aging parent, or 10 tips for splitting caregiving costs among siblings, just to name a few, visit aarp.org/caregiving. There you will find the Caregivers Resource Center, which hosts lots of free caregiving resources. Linda will share more about these resources later in the program. Now, for Genealogy 301, Forensics to Find Heirs, Trace Lineage, and Solve Crimes. Our speaker today is Dr. Catherine O'Connell. Catherine is an experienced forensic genealogy. She assists attorneys, major banks, and title companies in locating missing and unknown heirs, and has provided due diligence in nearly 200 probate cases in locations throughout the United States and internationally. She's a member of the Estate Planning Council of Cleveland, the Association of Professional Genealogists, and the National Genealogical Society. So what is forensic genealogy? I'm going to let Dr. Catherine explain that as she shares how forensic genealogy helps to find family members listed in wills, locating family members for the military, and working with the police to solve crimes. She will share a sample case, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of her presentation. Just remember to put your questions in the Q&A icon. Welcome, Dr. Catherine O'Connell.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started today. I'm so excited to see all of you. And what I think was really fun was that that when I saw all the names and the places where you were from, I thought, I've worked there and I've worked there. So it's really exciting to see so many people from the places that I've researched. So thank you so much for joining us today. So forensic genealogy is a lot like traditional genealogy in that we use court records and various things to explore families, but it's a little bit like private investigation as well. It's very, because we're looking sometimes for living people as well as people in the past, that both those fields kind of rub up against each other, and that's partly what makes it so exciting. As I said, my name's Catherine O'Connell. I do forensic genealogy, and I thought I might just introduce you just a little bit to what forensic genealogy is all about before we get into all the slides. One of the ways it's different from genealogy that you might have done for your own family is that it's very fast. We're often, rather than spending a lifetime really delving deeply into our family, which is a wonderful pastime, sometimes we're asked to create an entire family tree for a family in just a couple of weeks. So the pace is very fast. And the other thing that's different about it is that we have to have a super high degree of accuracy because any of our findings could be challenged in court. And so in the back of my mind is always, can I prove this to a judge? Can I prove this to a judge? And so everything has to be documented very carefully in order for everything to pass muster in the court system. So every case has its own situation, but so this one I'm going to start with, I think, is kind of represents a lot of what I do, and also the story itself kind of represents the way cases go. A couple years ago, I had a client come and he said, this woman died without a will, and her husband died before her, and she had no children. So we don't know who's going to inherit her house. He was assigned by the court to locate the heirs, sell the house, and then distribute the proceeds of the house to whoever her family was, but he didn't know who they were. So the first thing I said to do was go to her house and look for an address book. Maybe there'll be something that says, I don't think the people usually label, this is my sister, but that would be really nice, wouldn't it? So he went over there and I didn't hear anything until the next day. And he called and he said, it was quite a day. He went in there and the house was just full to the brim with stuff. There was just papers and boxes and everything everywhere. And he said, I almost tripped when I got in the door because immediately in front of me were all these cat toys. The cats were gone, but the lady had made these little crumpled up balls of foil, and he was worried he was going to trip on them and all this stuff. So he picked them up and rounded them up, and his assistant saw something green sticking out of the corner. So he looked inside and he saw a $50 bill. And it turns out there was $300 just crumpled up in the cat toys. So then he was on alert. So he went to go wash his hands in the kitchen, and he found 3 diamond rings in the dishwasher. He found insurance policies in the cereal cupboard. He found stuff all over that house. And what he thought was going to be just kind of a small little house that he was going to sell ended up being much more valuable. There were all these other insurance policies and things. And I felt so much like this is what I think. I go into a case, I think, oh, I'm going to find this many people, or it's going to take me this many hours. And then you're always surprises around every corner. And that's partly what makes the work so exciting and so fun, but it also can make it very frustrating and confusing sometimes as well. So I think we all know that family can be complicated. I always think, oh, there's going to be that perfect family out there, but I don't come from one myself, and I'm sure none of you do either. But I certainly get called into complicated family situations, because if a family is really functional and knows everything about each other, then they don't need to hire me to locate who the family is, because they already know. So the minute I'm called in, I know I'm being put in the middle of a situation that can be very painful for the family. And one of the cases I worked on, I was told that a woman had died. She left a will, and her son was her only inheritor, but she hadn't talked to him for 20 years. And they asked me to find his address. So I found his address, and I said, okay, here it is. And they said, well, you call him up. Just tell him his mother died. It's no big thing. He's already estranged for her. It won't be a problem. So I was kind of shocked, but I called and I had to tell him that his mother had died, and he was so devastated. He was really, really upset. He had thought he would have a chance to say goodbye, and he never did. And then it turned out that she had died several months before, and I had just been called in. But, the fact that he had missed and gone months not knowing that this had happened was very painful for him. So I try to really respect the families, the pain that they're facing. I try not to contact them if I don't need to, because I don't want to be creating more friction in an already difficult situation. But sometimes I do need to do family interviews. And when I do, I try to really be there for the families and try to put myself in their shoes and understand where they're coming from. So today I'm going to give you an introduction to the forensic genealogy field as a whole, and then I'll take you through the kind of sample case that I would work on, and I'll take some questions at the end. So we work in many different fields, and I like to think of it the way you go to a doctor. If you've got the flu, you might go to an urgent care center or to your general practitioner, but you certainly would not ask your general practitioner to do your knee surgery. So it's the same thing in forensic genealogy. You take a lot of training. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And because it's so complex and there's so many legal issues we need to know about, we tend to specialize in one area, sometimes two, but we're not going to do all those areas. So when there's an area that I don't work in, such as citizenship, I always will refer to someone who's a specialist in that field so that they can get the best help that they need. So I work in estates and probate. We already mentioned that I look for missing or unknown heirs to an estate. I also look into who inherits for like insurance companies. They may have listed someone that may be a beneficiary on there, but nobody knows where they are. There's lots of different complicated families, second families, blended families, half siblings people lose track of. And so I end up looking for them. So a lot of this is like private investigation mixed with genealogy. Real estate is very similar in that you're tracing family members, kind of similar to estates and probate, but you're working with deeds and tracing owners of deeds. And I think the best way to understand it is for me to give you an example of a case my colleague had that I just found fascinating. He was called by an attorney who said this family owned this cottage on a lake in Maine for 100 years. They'd been going there forever, and they just couldn't keep up with it anymore. So they decided to sell it. They found a new buyer. Everything was going well. They're getting ready to transfer the title. And they found out that on the deed and the title, the last owner had forgotten to add the front lawn. And so they didn't own their own front lawn that they've been using for 100 years. So they had asked my colleague to go research, find the family from 100 years ago, whoever it was who owned that house, and find who was living today so they could sign off on the deed. So he did, the thing transferred, and there's new owners of a beautiful front lawn on a lakefront. Sometimes people won't know who a property owner is or where they went. They might need that traced, things like that. Citizenship applications are very interesting and very complex. A couple of countries like Ireland and Italy have some laws on their books that say that if someone immigrated to the US or another country and never became a citizen of that country, then their children and or grandchildren or great-grandchildren can consider themselves Italian or, in the case of Ireland, Irish citizens. But they don't make it easy. This is government, after all, bureaucracy. And so you have to be able to trace every single person in their line and who got what, they got married, their children, their death certificate, the next generation. And you have to present all of this to the government consulate. And so you're basically dealing with US government and the government of the other country. And there's a lot of different laws and rules that you need to know about. So I don't really go near this because I want to make sure people get this right. And I don't have the training for the government documents. So I always pass that on. People sometimes want to become a member of a Native American tribe. They may have discovered that they have this ancestry or that they have an already enrolled member of their family and they want to enroll. Again, you're working with the tribal government and the US government. And so there's people who specialize in that area as well. And I've got some wonderful, very talented colleagues in this field, and I really admire their work. And of course, the baby in the family is DNA. DNA is very new to genealogy. Only in the last 20 years or so was it really even sort of discovered as a way for people to use their own personal genealogy and their genetics to understand their families. And really, I would say it's taken off in the last 7 to 10 years. And every year there's just an explosion in the number of people who take consumer tests to learn more about their genetic ancestry. And when you do that kind of work and you're trying to learn more, you might make some unexpected discoveries. Some people discover that they were born to a sperm donor and they never knew it. Some people may discover that their sister is not biologically related to them. They might discover that they were adopted and never knew it. So there's all kinds of discoveries that people make, and they need help unraveling that. And so people who deal with unknown parentage cases come to genealogists, forensic genealogists, for help. And I do some of this work. I really enjoy it. It's very interesting work, but it's also very complicated. And so it requires a lot of training. Speaking of a lot of training, you definitely need in crime investigations, such as investigative genetic genealogy, you need a lot of training. So a lot of people from law enforcement, cold cases or other cases, are being trained in forensic genealogy to learn how to trace DNA matches and link those to genealogical documents to find people they might not otherwise be able to solve that murder. So there was a recent case where some students were killed at Idaho State University. They used genetic genealogy and that kind of technique to locate the killer or the accused killer. The Golden State Killer case was it was a cold case. They couldn't solve it for a really long time. They had no suspects, but by using DNA samples and matching it with genealogical records, they figured out who might have done the crime and got a DNA sample from him. And they actually were able to arrest him many, many years after the murders had taken place. So it's really important and incredible work. It also involves a lot of privacy issues and things that all the researchers need to be aware of. I have colleagues now who are working on national certification, because you don't want just anyone picking up these DNA cases and trying to go out there and solve murders. These are really the best with law enforcement. the genealogists in general work as part of a law enforcement team. They need to follow very, very strict terms of use for all the DNA companies and the way that they work. And there's been controversies with people not following that correctly. And so there's a lot of call for people to be regulated by either individual states or preferably a national system, so that people can make sure that their DNA is being handled properly and by people with good training. Another really interesting part of the field is John Doe or Jane Doe identification. And this is where somebody may die and nobody knows who they are. They might just find a body, there's no wallet on them, they have no idea who it is. And the coroner will take a DNA sample and submit it to a lab. And volunteers will take the sample and try to analyze the matches and find out who their genetic family is. And then the law enforcement or the coroner will contact that family and reunite them with their loved ones. So that's a really, really wonderful part of forensic genealogy. Military repatriation is another field that is very similar to the John Doe identification. People who died in foreign conflicts abroad sometimes were never found. They might be missing POWs or just died as part of a battle and were never recovered. And so the US government has licensed forensic genealogists who are ready to trace whatever remains they find in the field. They get genetic samples. The genealogists don't go anywhere near the bones, nowhere near the DNA, but they are asked to find all the people who might have disappeared in that area, the missing people. They might have a list, and they trace the list of missing people's families to the present day, ask them to do a DNA sample that's done by the government, and they will match that sample with the person whose remains they found. And oftentimes this can resolve 100-year, 70-year, 50-year mysteries that these families have been living with. So it's a very rewarding part of the field. And a lot of people who are ex-military sometimes will go back into that field to help out because they know how much this means to the families. One thing to know, DNA is not magic. You know, we all watch CSI, we've watched these fun TV shows, but just the way TV shows aren't what real life is, DNA is not going to solve every single case. There's, protocols that need to be followed. The DNA tests done by a court lab are not the same as the consumer DNA test that you can buy on the internet for your own entertainment. They're testing different parts of the genome. They're not good. It's like apples and oranges. So you can't test yourself and then test it against a court sample and learn anything useful, nor would that be legal. So it's very good to be aware of the privacy settings, the terms of use for every DNA company, to really acquaint yourself with that before you take a DNA test and kind of know what you're getting into. And also to have, as I said, we're hoping there will be national licensing for these, for researchers, so that you will know what you're getting into when you have a criminal investigation. You'll know that that person is certified to do that work. And because the field's so young, they really don't know how that's, how all that's going to shake out. So we're in a time of tremendous change. It's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next in this field. So for me, there's 3 research categories, and I'm going to go through each one of them in turn, so you can kind of see how the different categories work. The first one is the intestate heir. That's when somebody dies without a will. Intestate means without a will. Or it could be the unnamed descendant of a property owner. So I mentioned 2 unknown person type of cases, the person with the diamonds in her dishwasher and the property owner, where we didn't know who owned that front lawn property until a genealogist went and traced who those people were. So that is an unknown person. A missing person is where you know the name. They might be listed in the will, but the family has no idea where they are. And I had a really interesting case last year from a bank and a trust case where this grandmother had listed her grandson in the trust and said, I want part of my estate to go to him. The problem was that he had disappeared 30 years before. His family had no idea where they were, where he was. He had some addiction issues. They looked for him kind of on and off, but they never really did a big search because they just figured either he'd turn up or he was dead. I don't quite understand their lack of urgency, but this was the situation. So they asked me to locate him because they couldn't distribute any of the trust, any of the money from the grandmother until everyone was found. So I looked for him in Florida and I found his last known driver's license, and it was for a fake address. The address was in the middle of an intersection. It didn't exist. Then I looked at his address for some arrests that he had. Again, the property had been torn down. There was really just no leads to this person. It was so long ago. I called the coroner's office. They had no one missing from that time frame 30 years ago who matched his description. I looked through every single missing person in the county for the last 30 years and couldn't find anyone. I called the police department and asked, what can I do? And they said, well, what was he wearing when he went missing? I said, this was 30 years ago. And they just laughed. They just said, you're not going to find him. So I ended up documenting every single place I looked. The finding of, that this was a fake address. I looked here, and, this place was torn down. He was arrested in this county, but he didn't stay there. He moved to another county. Every single thing, about 25 steps I took to find this person, and none of them worked. And the court looked at it and said, okay, we can't rule him dead because that's a different law and a different statute, but we can say that you did your due diligence and we can now release the estate and we'll save a little piece of it for him. And then if he ever turns up, we'll find him and give it to him. If he wants to go to the state and say, I'm ready for my money, then that would happen. So in a way, you can sometimes with these cases, you can still resolve it, even if you're not able to find that person. That said, I found lots of people who were homeless, maybe who were addicted, but I can still locate where they are, and they can still get what they're owed. So most of the time I can find someone, but in the few times when I haven't been able to, sometimes you can still offer some solution to the client and the family. So some people say, well, I'm good at genealogy. I like doing genealogy for my family. And why don't I just, solve this case for the lawyer who's looking for my cousin's kids? And I would say, well, you're welcome to do your best. I'm sure a lot of people can do a good job. But remember what I said about legal risk. If you are not somebody who knows how to document everything for the court, and you can absolutely prove that there is no problem and you found every single person in the family, then, if you can't do that, you might be in trouble, because someone from the family, if you missed them, can sue both the attorney and you, and that could be really scary. So I don't recommend, when it's a legal matter, doing this by yourself. You might be able to show your research to someone who does this professionally. I have a lot of insurance for liability. I'm constantly aware of it, and I work to a court level because I need to, right, to protect myself and my clients. So just keep that in mind. The other thing is also training. I've got so many years of training and so much experience. I've done like more than 200 cases all over the world. And so this gives me a chance to know what I'm getting into, what some of the pitfalls might be, what I need to do for the court. And that really helps. And the last thing is to show accuracy and due diligence. So if you looked on your own because you're a really good researcher, but you didn't document every single step and make a source citation in your report and affidavit, then if you missed one, the court might say, I don't think you tried hard enough. I'm used to doing that, notating every step, because I know the kind of level I have to work for the court. So I think it can be helpful if you want to help somebody with this, but sometimes it's just like you wouldn't maybe necessarily write your own will and stick it in a drawer. You might hire a lawyer to do it. this would be one time if there's legal risk when you might really want to leave it to somebody who does this professionally. The other reason to not do this by yourself is because there are a lot of state laws. As we've been seeing with various things in the news lately, every state has their own government and their own laws, and it varies state to state. So I was looking for a divorce record in San Francisco, and I was able to order it last week. I looked for one in New Jersey this week, and New Jersey doesn't allow anyone to order a divorce record except for the person who's divorced. And I said, well, that person's dead. Like, I just need to see who their children are so I can make sure they inherit. And they said, sorry, if they're dead, no one gets that divorce record. So you really have to know the laws for each place and abide by them. There are especially laws for who needs to have a private investigator license if you're looking for living people. For example, in Florida, in Arizona, if you start looking for living people and you don't, you start making calls on your own, that's not legal. You need to have a private investigator with a license doing that, because they don't want people to do scams and things like that. I guess it's to protect their residents. But I know which states I can look in and which states I need to get my lawyer client to call, and which states I have a PI license in Ohio, but I may need to call a colleague in Arizona if I need somebody on the ground there. So it's just good to know these laws. And then when you work abroad and I was dealing with several cases in the EU and in Europe, and they have very different privacy laws of what you can look for and what you can access and what court documents you can get. And I have had to learn the laws of each country so that I can make sure that I'm staying within those laws when I'm trying to get records. So the places where I search are probably very similar if you do family research yourself. The first choice, if I can get it, is a vital record or a court record. These are government issued records, or they are approved by the government. And so you can use those as evidence in any kind of hearing, either federal courts or in state courts. So getting a marriage record, a divorce record, a deed, a will, things like that, those are the gold standard. A birth certificate, a death certificate. Sometimes you can't get those because the laws in the state won't let you get them. So sometimes you need to turn to a secondary record like a church record. So a baptismal record with the child's date of birth and the parents' names on it might be able to substitute in some cases for a birth certificate, depending on what you're looking for and what kind of case it's for. We often will use cemetery records. When you see two people with the same last name buried right next to each other, that can indicate that those people are family. We go to Find a Grave all the time. I don't know if you all know about that site, very commonly used. And basically there's photos of headstones and their burial records and sometimes an obituary on there. It's super, super helpful. And it lets you know where someone died and gives you a chance to figure out, okay, they died in 1897. I need to look for their death certificate, that kind of thing. We often use newspaper articles, yearbooks, anything that will list family members. And I really have to say newspaper articles are great. If you see a wedding announcement, it may list the bride and groom and the parents, which you could get on a marriage license. But when you see an article about the wedding, you might see the brothers and sisters and cousins and all listed. And it may even say how they're related. It'll say the bride's sister was the matron of honor. All those things give you information that you might not have gotten somewhere else. I frequently use phone books, city directories, which may list a person, their occupation, where they lived, their address, all kinds of information that I can then trace the family members to. So if I see 3 different people with the same name and they're all living in the same address, that can be very, very helpful. I also use other archives. One time I found, a church bulletin somewhere in some archive, and I was looking for a woman in Florida and I just could not find her anywhere, but I found this church bulletin that said that she'd won the pie making contest. And it was great because I hadn't been able to find her anywhere else. So I called the church and I said, I'm looking for this person who won the pie contest. And could you please give them my number? She's going to inherit money. And so the church was very suspicious, but they called her and gave her my number, and I talked to her, and she ended up, getting her inheritance. So all of these things are very helpful. To show you kind of in detail how I use records and how a case might work, I'm going to take you through a sample case. In this case, this was a few years ago in 2019, a bank was trying to distribute a trust that had been written in 1901. So this was almost a 120-year-old will or trust that still was in flux, I guess. The father, John Doe, I've changed his name for privacy purposes. He left his mansion and his land to his wife, Hannah Francis, and their 3 children. And he left a small bequest to somebody named Sally Smith. In 1950, the lawyer for the family, who was distributing the trust every year, the proceeds from it, discovered oil and gas on the land. And they rewrote the trust to give everyone who was mentioned in the trust originally, Sally Smith and the rest of the family, all would own a share in these mineral rights. And then nothing happened for almost 100 years. And then in 2019, a drilling company found gas on the land, and they wanted to drill, but they needed the permission of the trust holders or their descendants in order to be able to do that. And everyone had to sign off in order to get these mineral rights. So they asked me to locate the entire family, Hannah Francis, John Doe, and their 3 children, but also Sally Smith. Nobody knew who she was. So I worked on the entire family, but today I'm going to take you through the Sally Smith part of it, just because that's a small piece that we can easily get through in one evening. I don't want to talk all about the craziness with the rest of the family, but we're just going to do Sally Smith. So the first leap was to figure out who she was and why was she listed in the will. So of course my brain went wild. I thought, could she be the nanny who raised all the children? Could she be the cook for the family? Could she have been a secret lover of John Doe? My brain started going, into fantasy. And then I realized I need to push all that aside and go with the facts. So what I decided to do was start with the family, with the trust, Hannah Francis, John Doe, and their 3 children, and see if Sally turned up as I was researching that family. And sure enough, I was looking into a marriage record for Hannah Francis and John Doe, and Hannah Francis's maiden name was Smith. And so Sally Smith might be a sister. So one of the things we're going to look into today is some of the issues that came up with Sally Smith, Hannah Francis's sister. We're going to see how name changes for women can affect research. We're going to see all the different records that I needed to resolve it. And we're going to find unexpected complexities, because this is the name of the game in this line of work. So here's a baptismal certificate for Hannah Francis and her siblings, and they were all baptized on the same day in 1865. And what's nice about this document is it lists everybody's birth date, which is very nice, and in birth order. So you see that Hannah Francis was the eldest, Wilford Downs was the 2nd child, Lizzie Bell was the 3rd, and Sally Ann was the 4th child born. And then they had a little brother named Ulysses Simpson Grant. And one of the things I really liked about this family is it had very distinctive names. Sometimes you'll have a thing where there's a lot of people like John and Mary and Robert, and then you'll see a family with the same exact last name, and it's the same children's names, and it can get very confusing. But in this case, every child had this sort of distinctive name, and that really helped me research them as a group and prove to the court that they were all part of the same group. So in 1880, just a little ways after this baptism, you see that unfortunately Cynthia's husband had died. She was a widow. And you see Hannah Francis, Wilford Downs, Elizabeth Bell instead of Lizzie Bell. And then you see the fourth child is not referred to as Sally, but as Sarah. And this is very common. I think any of you who do family research, you'll see in census records that sometimes people are listed by a nickname, sometimes they're listed by their full name. It really can vary. But the reason that you know it's the same group of people is because in general, the group is the same. So you see U.S. Grant. These are the same names. They're just slightly different. Like it's not a nickname, it's their full name, but you can see the same age, the same birth order. And you notice there might be 3 more children in this family. W.J. Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and R. Burke. His name was Robert Burke. And so altogether, there were 8 children in the family. And I was keeping track of this family group as they moved through time. In 1900, you see that Cynthia and the 3 unmarried children, Lizzie Bell, Sally Ann, and here he's known as Burke, but his name was Robert Burke, all moved to Ridgeway Township in Elk County, Pennsylvania, which was just down the street from where John Doe lived. And so this was also a nice way of being able to prove to the court this family is the same family. They were living in the same town. John Doe would have known Sally Ann, and she was an unmarried daughter. And so maybe this is, and maybe the closest, family member, maybe she was the best sister of Hannah Francis, and that's why he listed her. I don't want to make any suppositions, but I can place a Sally Ann Smith in the same town with Hannah Francis. And so I put that in my court report. So in 1901 was the year after that census record. You see that, and after the will was written in 1901, in 1902, Sally Ann got married for the first time. She was age 39, and she married this person named Isaac Jones. He was from Illinois, and he was 20 years older than she was, and had been married before. And all this is in their wedding certificate. And one of the things I thought was interesting was, he was a businessman in Illinois. It says he's a merchant. And so I could expect to find them possibly in Illinois. I didn't find them in Pennsylvania in the next census, but I looked for them in Illinois. And in 1910, almost 10 years after their marriage, I found them in Illinois with no children. She was age 48, and there were no children of the marriage. And so I could say, okay, I'm supposed to find the children or next of kin of Sally Ann, and it doesn't look like she had children. But she could have adopted a child. She could have had a child late in life. So I needed to follow her for the rest of until her death. So then in 1913, Isaac died. And apparently he died on a business trip in a hotel following a stroke. He had been in Arkansas on a business trip. He was returning home. And it turns out he wasn't just a merchant. He was the senior partner in this large department store, and he had business in Arkansas. So it was kind of interesting learning more about him. And also, I was looking for where did Sally Smith go? Her husband died in 1913. Where was she going to go? So I looked in Pennsylvania and I looked in Illinois, and I couldn't find her. And so I needed to look in more newspaper records to find what happened to her. And what I discovered was that Isaac had owned a rice plantation in Arkansas. And it says that his wife and brother will continue the business. So I thought maybe it was his brother, but it turns out it was Sally Ann and her brother, Benjamin Franklin, moved down to Arkansas and kept this rice plantation going. And so that by reading the newspapers, I was able to follow records to Arkansas, which would not be the first place you would think of this family living. They had no ties to Arkansas with their family, but because of this business interest, that's where they went. So one of the interesting things was when they filed the will, I learned that Sally, we've always called her Sally. She was Sally in her marriage record, but we know she had the name Sarah. She decided she was going by the name Sarah in the newspaper article here. And I was kind of wondering why she wasn't using Sally when she'd used it much of her life. And then I discovered that he left this great amount of money as part of his will. His estate was worth $300,000, which is about 9 to 10 million in today's dollars, a lot of money back then. And he left money to build this exact monument on the right. And what he wanted to do was to his first wife and their infant son who had died maybe 20 years before. And he wanted to be buried with them. And his first wife's name was Sally. And I thought, I bet Sarah decided she wanted to go by Sarah because she didn't want to be called the same name as his first wife. We don't know. All I do know is that in all records going forward, she's known as Sarah Jones. No longer Sally Smith, but Sarah Jones. And that may be why the family couldn't find her in 1950, because they were looking for someone with a different name and they couldn't find her. She moved to Arkansas. No one in Pennsylvania had probably ever thought that she was in Arkansas. So maybe she was trying to get away from, this big monument to the first wife, who knows? But she moved to Arkansas and she proceeded to spend every penny of his estate. And I saw all these newspaper articles saying that she was in debt. She owed money for curtains and extravagant dinner parties and things like that. And finally, her brother Benjamin Franklin died. She continued living in his home with his family. And then eventually she died at the age of 98. And one of the things I thought was sad was she had such a colorful life, such an interesting life, and yet she's known as the widow of Osak, not even the correctly spelled first name. And it just says that she was a Methodist, which is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't say anything about how interesting and colorful and crazy all her adventures were. One thing I noted about this obituary is there are no children listed. I searched for a will in Arkansas and found no will. She did not leave a will. I got a certified statement from the courthouse that there was no will filed for her. And that meant she died intestate, which means without a will. And that meant her next of kin was just like the person with the diamonds in the dishwasher. It was her brothers and sisters. And we all know how many of those there were. So she had 7 brothers and sisters, all born between 1856 and probably 1868. So I had to trace them all, almost 150 years from then until the present day, and find all the living next of kin. And there was a lot of interesting things that I learned. One thing was that Ulysses Simpson Grant was 20 years old when he died. He had a newborn baby, and the mother and he were recovering with the baby at her parents' house, and an oil lamp tipped over and set the house on fire. And he rescued the baby and the wife, got them outside, and then died of smoke inhalation and burns. But his child survived and I found him in Missouri. His great-grandchild was the person who inherited. And each person had a fascinating story and a fascinating family all over the country. So by the end of this case, I had more than 200 people inheriting. The bottom fell out of the gas market. And when the bank did the calculations for the mineral rights, they each got 56 cents. So after all that work, it didn't end up being much for the descendants, but it was a very interesting and wild ride researching all of these people. And I really enjoyed getting to know their family. So there are times when it gets really hard. And I would say finding people who are of low socioeconomic status can be very difficult. People who don't own property don't always turn up in databases. People who move frequently because, they might not be able to get their rent, so they may move in with friends. If you don't have credit, you don't turn up in a lot of records. So it can be very difficult to find people in poverty. And there are a lot of disparities in the records available for people of color in this country. And I've done a lot of extra training in that because I want to make sure that everyone's family has a chance to be found. But sometimes the records, such as newspapers, older newspapers, people of color weren't allowed to be in the white newspapers. And so you won't find an obituary that might solve the whole case. If you have an African-American paper, it might not be digitized. You might have to go on site and research page by page, whereas some of the other papers are all online. So it can be difficult to find records, but I feel like with enough training, I try to make it equal so that everyone's got a shot. Another thing that's very difficult is when people change their names and people say, oh, well, my relative got a new name at Ellis Island. But what I've found in my experience is that it sometimes happens over decades. A family may come with an ethnic name or a very long or difficult to pronounce name, and over 20 or 30 years, one member might change their name, but the rest of the family keeps it, things like that. And I had a really interesting case with this person named Siegfried Strepstakowski that I was trying to find. And Siegfried was born in 1920, and I was looking for his children, and he just disappeared. And I thought, well, maybe he died in World War II, and I just couldn't find a single record for him. So I called his 97-year-old brother, Joe, and talked to him, and he said, oh, no, that's my brother, Frank. He got to the draft registration board in 1942, and he knew that Siegfried was a German-sounding name, and he was going to get a lot of hazing for that. And he knew that Strepstakowski was going to be misspelled every day of boot camp. So on the spot, he said, my name's Frank Stanley. And he actually kept that name. He married under that name. His children's birth certificate had the name Frank Stanley. And I had the fun job of proving to the court that Siegfried Strepstakowski and Frank Stanley were the same person from the same parents. And we ended up being able to distribute the estate. Everybody else in the family had Strepstakowski. Frank had his own last name. The other issue is when women remarry and undergo multiple name changes. That can be a real issue. I had a case last week where I was looking for somebody in one state, and it turns out she married 7 times. She moved almost every time to a new state when she married. And the 8th time, she had a different last name, and there was no husband attached to it. And I couldn't figure out who it was or if she had children with that last name. And it turns out she took her mother's maiden name for her last name. She'd given up on marriage altogether, and she was just going by her mother's maiden name. So when women change their names a lot, it can really look like they perhaps have died. And then you find them in another place and you realize they're still there. They're just under another name. So sometimes you have to get very creative. I solved a case using a tattoo one time. This person had a long criminal record. He had lived in a couple of different states, and I traced his record. It was a missing person case, and I couldn't find him. I knew he was out of prison because I'd found his inmate record. And as part of his inmate record, it had a list of distinguishing tattoos. That's something that they just do so that if the person escapes, maybe they can find them. And they had a photo of this guy with a tattoo. It wasn't Linda, but I'm using this one here. It said Linda on his neck. And I thought this guy must really care about her to put that in such an obvious place on his body. So I remembered that one of the co-defendants in a legal case that he was involved in was named Linda. And I thought maybe he married her. So I matched up that first name Linda with the last name, his last name, and found her living with her family because I knew her maiden name from the arrest record. And I found her living in a 3rd state that we'd never thought of. But I called her up and I left a message and said, if you're the spouse of this person, could you please have him call me? There's money involved. And an hour later, the phone rang and it was him. And I thought, oh my gosh, I know what this guy did and he's got my phone number. But I was able to give him the lawyer's name and he inherited the estate. So sometimes you have to get very creative. Because I want to put myself out of a job, I definitely want to say, please leave a will. If you can't do anything else, this would help your family so much. And when you're writing a will, think about names. If you have a first marriage and now you're married to a second person, list your first, say the children of my first marriage, and then list them by their name. If you've got women who have married and taken their husband's name, put their maiden name in the middle, like Sally Doe Smith, for example, something like that, so that they can be found later on. Putting dates of birth might be helpful, depending on, if you want to have all that information in there. State relationships. I leave this to my son, X, and my stepson, Y. Sometimes you're seeing people like millennials maybe taking the wife's maiden name because they like that name better, or using hyphenated names, or even making up their own last name. All of that's fine, but put the name and their relationship to you. So, I leave my house to my daughter, Mary McGillicuddy, my child, and her husband, and then that name. So you have all the names, even if it's an unusual name, even if it's not related to your name, put it in there. And I've also had questions from people who've said, I've got an estranged family member, or I've lost touch with my son and I don't know where he is anymore. And I would say, put as much information in your document as you can. So, when you're thinking about Mike, the guy who went missing in Florida, you could say, I leave this to Mike, last seen in 1994 in this county in Florida. And at least you give the researcher who might come next after you a way to start the search. So you don't have to know everything. It doesn't have to be perfect, but whatever you can do would really help your descendants get the money and their inheritance that is so rightfully theirs. So to recap, we can assist in many different fields of law where there's questions about family. And it really requires quite a lot of specialized training and experience. And when you're doing your own research, think about a lot of record sets, court records, newspapers, archives, all kinds of things. Get creative with what you're using to document your own family, and for sure, make a will. And when you're making that will, really mention names, make sure it's as complete as possible so that people can inherit what you want them to inherit. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully you have some questions for me.
Great. That was a great presentation, Catherine. Thank you so much. And yes, we have almost 20 questions. So
oh my goodness.
We'll use this last 15 minutes or so answering those. So I won't delay. We have a question from Carol. How does someone become trained as a forensic genealogist?
Well, I started by sort of interning with somebody who was a private investigator, and it turns out he was a forensic genealogist, but he called himself a private investigator. It's a really interesting field. There are some workshops and things like that you can take in the summer. The Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh or Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. They used to have 2 courses in that. Right now, the people who are teaching that are not teaching it anymore, but they are writing a book. So you might be able to find that. There's a chapter in a professional genealogy. If you look up professional genealogy, it's a giant, like 700 page book. You might be able to look through there and learn a little bit more. But there's certainly trainings out there. It's just a little bit hard to uncover.
Okay, thank you for that. And I saw a question come in about will there be a part 2. I was going to say this later, but put in chat for us not questions, but topics you'd like to know as it pertains to genealogy. This is Genealogy 301. It's the 3rd one we've done. If you missed the first 2, you can go to AARP Ohio's YouTube page, and that link will be in the chat. And you can see Genealogy 101 and Genealogy 201, African American Roots, there as well, and get a host of information. But we love to keep this going. Just tell us what you'd like to learn about, and we'll have Genealogy 401. All right, so next, what is the national organization that would certify forensic genealogists? I think you just answered that. Or was that just for DNA analysis?
There is the Board for Certification of Genealogists. That does not really pertain to DNA so much, but there is the Board for Certification of Genealogists. It's not geared entirely toward forensic people, but you can still get that certification if you want. The national certification is still being rolled out, so that doesn't exist yet. They're in the planning stages right now, and I think in the next year or two, something will be coming out for about that.
Okay, great. I think we might have a couple questions here about Native American genealogy. Does someone need an expert to trace their Native American genealogy, and how would they do that?
You don't necessarily need an expert. I would say document whatever you have, how you know it, where where this might have been, what tribe it might be. If you want to have citizenship, you probably would want somebody who specializes in that. And there are people who specialize in Native American genealogy, and you can find those things you can find people who do this kind of work online. You might just even be able to Google it. But I would say you don't necessarily need specialized training in that. You just need somebody who's willing to look at those records.
Would they be able, while you were doing your presentation, I put a couple of resources in chat to the Association of Professional Genealogists and the National Genealogical Society.
Yeah.
Could they go there for those?
Those are really good sites, and there's a directory on the Association of Professional Genealogists, and they list specialties. So, I think they also are training sometimes in this, not so much in Native American, but certainly Deborah Abbott, who gave some of the earlier genealogy courses 101 and 201, is a tremendous researcher, and I definitely recommend watching those videos. She's really excellent.
Yeah, Deborah was with us for Genealogy 201, African American Roots, and we had another guest for Genealogy 101, but those are both on our AARP Ohio YouTube page to go there. I'm going to stay on the Native American question because we have another one. Marianne says, I'm interested in tribal membership. My mother's side of the family was told her grandmother was in the Cherokee tribe, but when I did my DNA testing, there was no trace of American Indian in mine or any side of the family who submitted their DNA. I heard that American Indians do not allow their blood to be tested. So how would a person prove their American Indian heritage?
I think it's very difficult, and I think a lot of people have these stories where there have been this sort of the family lore that they have Native American ancestry, and then it doesn't turn up in their DNA. And that can be, if it's a far enough back, because you inherit less and less DNA according to successive generations, you inherit 50% from your parents and then 25% from each grandparent. So once you get into the great grandparents, you've got a very small amount. And if you're getting farther back, it may be almost too small to trace. And so I think I would talk to somebody who specializes in that kind of research. It can be very, very hard to prove. I don't want to give you false hope. I think, you'd really have to look for documentary records. I think the tribes don't like to go by DNA. I think they want to go by paper records. And so you'd need to really find those paper records. I would say if you find that you have a great deal of Native American, ancestry, and that might lead you to a certain place where your family lived, then you could find the documents. That would be the way to do citizenship, rather than trying to prove when you don't have any in your DNA. I hope that makes sense.
All right. We have a lot of questions. Okay. I'm trying to get through them as fast as possible before we close. We have a little bit more information that we'd like to share with you about caregiving. So someone asked, how did you locate the homeless person? Or how do you locate homeless people?
Yeah, well, I knew where his mother had told the attorney where she thought he might be living. I've worked with several homeless people, and so I called every shelter and I left messages at each place, because there's some HIPAA laws, especially if there's any addiction treatment or things like that. Then you're getting into HIPAA laws and healthcare laws, and they cannot give out any information about whether that person is there or not, because it's not according to the HIPAA laws. So I left messages and said, if he comes in and you want to give him this piece of paper, I can't say that he's there or not, but if you want to give him something, if you see him, then pass it along. And so that's what I did. And I think a care worker for him or something recognized the name gave him my number, and we were able to connect with the attorney.
Awesome. Okay, so in your New Jersey example of the divorce record being allowed, could you put a notice in a local paper indicating for whom you were looking?
Well, in this case, I could have, and publication can be a way to get around some of, like, if you can't find someone, the attorney can publish notifying people that they're being looked for, and that actually counts for having as part of the search, but oftentimes they need to show that they've done due diligence before that. In this case, I'm doing family interviews instead. These people died, both the mother and the father died, and so they wouldn't be able to answer a newspaper article, but maybe their children could, but I think the children have actually moved to another state. So I don't think the publication would be useful in that instance. And newspapers are tough because people don't read newspapers right now. They don't look at the paper. You know, you're maybe looking for an article on CNN. You're not leafing through each page of the local paper. And so it's very hard to find people with publication right now, unfortunately.
Okay, so Lori is asking, how can misspellings in official records be rectified? I need to obtain info about my mom, but on the marriage records, her name is misspelled. So it has rendered all requests null. It's as if she stopped existing. Any ideas?
Oh, that is so tough. It's very hard to get vital records changed after the fact. You can petition, I think, in the court where this happened. And I think you might want to talk to an attorney who might know more. Sometimes a courthouse will have like I know in my local courthouse in Cleveland, Ohio, they have a law clinic where you can go and ask questions. You could even ask the people. So if the vital record came from a certain county, call the court and say, I need to get this birth certificate changed. How do I do it? It's misspelled and it's creating problems for me. And they may give you an idea of the process.
Okay, great. How do you find the baptismal records, especially when you don't know the city and state?
That could be hard, I would say. I don't know where you would start. I think knowing family stories, talking about family interviews, if you know the name of the town or the city where they went and the religion they were, you can just look at every single church. It's a big hassle. And sometimes if someone is Catholic or, you know, someplace with a centralized diocese, sometimes those records will be kept all in one place. If you have a non-centralized church, but you know they might be out there, you can look. But I've been in this New Jersey case, I was looking for church records because I couldn't find an obituary, and the church closed and they threw out all their records. So it just depends on the church. It depends on luck in some ways. It depends on how centralized and organized the church is. So I would just sometimes working with a professional genealogist who knows the collections can be helpful. Maybe looking for a genealogy club or a historical society where people, or even the local library, the research librarians may know somebody and may know where to get started. I love librarians and they're often very helpful. So that can be a really good source of information if you don't know where to start.
Okay. A few people are asking about how to find records pre-1900. Let me first say, I recommend that you watch our Genealogy 201, Finding African American Roots webinar that's on AARP Ohio's YouTube page. We had a genealogist cover that extensively about how to get over that. What do they call it? The 1890 wall, the brick wall?
Well, yeah, the 1860 wall, because
there you go.
Especially if you had enslaved ancestors, it can be a really difficult thing. But Debbie, I've taken trainings from Deborah Abbott, and she's just fantastic and really has a lot of great tips for how to do that. But census records go back to, you know, the 1800s, and you can look and see, and if you and then if you have African American ancestors, if you don't know if they were free, if they were, you know, free people of color, they will show up in a census, and if they weren't, they may show up in other records. So I would watch that collection, definitely.
Okay, so let's see here. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to take one or two more questions. I know the census data is made public after so many years. Is this true with other documents like church records or legal documents?
No, census records, I think it's 72 years. So we just got the 1950 census. And all the genealogists I knew took the day off work and just celebrated because we were so happy we had 10 more years of data. So it's going to be another while before another census collection comes out. Church records are privately held by the church. They're not a government record, so the church can hold on to them for as long as they want to and distribute if they want to. Most of the time they will share those records. I don't think there's any law about not distributing those. And if you're looking for, say, school records or things like that, you really just have to talk to the school district, or wherever you're looking for. That locality will have its own laws. Each courthouse will.
Okay, let's see here now. So many questions. How has social media affected your research?
I actually really find it helpful. I was looking for I think it's especially helpful for finding living people who don't have property and things like that, but they may have a social media presence and a family network, so that sometimes you can find one person in the family and even just figure out, it says it's their cousin or something like that, and then you can contact them and it can really, really help. So in this New Jersey case, I actually was using social media fairly extensively to try to find where this person lived. That said, if you want your records to be private, you've got to really be careful about your privacy settings, because, I'm using it as a research tool to find people, to help them with their inheritance. So, be aware of privacy settings. If you don't want somebody searching or looking at your social media, then make sure you've got all those settings set to private, so somebody can't see any of your records. And be careful about what you're revealing on there, because, I'm learning about all kinds of family relationships by people saying it on social media.
Okay, good to know. So I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of your questions. I'm going to take this one last question and then let you know how you can find out more. For someone who took a DNA test and their results were wrong, how can they, question that or get it corrected? How would they go about rectifying that?
Yeah, I don't think that you can correct a DNA test. I think if you're worried about something being wrong, I think you could retest, maybe with the same company, a different company. But people get unexpected results and they're not what they expected, and it can be very difficult. And I totally understand how hard that can be to learn something that you didn't expect. And I work with a lot of clients who have made these discoveries. And I think just understanding that your known family heritage, what you think to be true, or what you've grown up believing, is just as legitimate as what your genetic genealogy is. So you may learn that your father is not your biological father is not who you thought it was, but the father that raised you is still your father in all the most important ways. And so I think just realize that your genetic makeup is not always the 100% of your family's story. There's a lot of different stories that are legitimate and can coexist with each other. And I think we need to sort of get comfortable with that, because there's a lot of surprising things out there with genetic genealogy that we're learning.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. You're getting a lot of love in the chat. This was a very exciting and interesting presentation. We're glad that you found it interesting. We appreciate the kudos. We hope that you join us for another AARP event. I just want to thank you again, Catherine.
Yeah,
Dr.
thank you
Catherine
so much for
O'Connell.
having me. It was great to be here, and thank you all for attending.
Okay, thank you. So now, before I turn this presentation over to our wonderful volunteer, Linda, who's going to share some resources with you, just want to say thank you for joining us. Again, don't forget to put into chat genealogical topics you'd like to see in the future. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Linda.
Hello, I'm Linda. I'm an AARP volunteer like Sandy and many volunteers across the country. We help AARP to deliver on its mission to empower Americans 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. Because you joined us today, it's clear that family is important to you. So AARP wants to make sure you have resources to help you care for your family, your loved ones, and especially yourself. Being a family caregiver is one of the most important jobs you'll ever have, and one of the most challenging. First-time caregivers, long-distance caregivers, those caring for loved ones with dementia or cancer can find support and reduce the stress of caregiving by downloading one of our caregivers resource guides at aarp.org/caregiving. That's aarp.org/caregiving. There you will find tips, resources, support, and the AARP Caregiver Resource Center. Or you can call our resource line at 1-877-333-5885. Agents are available to take calls Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The support line is also available in Spanish at 1-888-971-2013. Again, visit aarp.org caregiving for free caregiving resources. Did you know that a new way to for members to experience AARP is by volunteering with us? As an AARP volunteer, you will help prevent fraud, support family givers, help make your home and community more livable for everyone as you age, engage voters, and support legislation and policies that benefit the 50 plus. And you can also enjoy fun, sporting, cultural, and community events, or even volunteer from home. I, like many AARP volunteers, find volunteering to be a fulfilling experience. So if you're interested in becoming an AARP volunteer in your area, visit aarp.org/I-want-to-volunteer. That's aarp.org/I-want-2-volunteer. And an AARP representative in your area will contact you. And finally, did you know that AARP is local, offering meaningful connections and enriching experiences close to home? To find AARP events near you, visit aarp.org/local. That's aarp.org/local. It's been a pleasure being with you today. Within the hour, you will receive a survey about this event. Please complete the survey to help us continually improve our offerings. Thank you for